Hey everybody, Daniel here again with Robert Beshara, one of my online buddies for many years now, and now first time we've been face to face. Super excited to bring him onto the program, talking today about Islamophobia, Muslim studies in the West and beyond, psychoanalysis. What Robert has actually coined a new kind of area of study within psychoanalysis, decolonial psychoanalysis. We're going to talk about that and have a wide-ranging conversation. As I think a lot of you know, I have a strong interest in the field of critical Muslim studies. Islamophobia has been a big area of my own interventions, my own research. So I'm also very much interested in Islam and psychoanalysis. So this is going to be a wide-ranging conversation. I think folks are going to learn quite a lot here. Robert has written an incredible translation of a Islamic scholar, a Muslim scholar. Is he Muslim or is he Christian Arab?
He's a Christian Arab. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a philosopher. Yeah.
He's a philosopher, Christian Arab, Murad Wahba. He wrote a book called Fundamentalism and Secularization, and this came out, Robert, in 2021.
It just came out earlier this year.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Robert, tell the viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Daniel, for the invitation. And I want to add that we've been corresponding probably since 2016. I think as I started doing research, as I was in the middle of research on psychoanalysis, the war on terror, Islamophobia, and looking at the connections between all three, I came across some of your articles, and you were kind of one of the early pioneers of writing on Islam and psychoanalysis. So I wanted to give you a shout out for that. So, but in terms of, yeah, go ahead. You wanted to say something?
Thanks, brother. No, thank you for that. We'll chat about that. Appreciate that, though.
Yeah, I recognize you. So in terms of my background, so my background is actually, not many people know that I'm a fine artist first and academic second. So my background is really in theater, music, and film. I was part of the underground artistic movement in Cairo, and that's what I did for a long time. And then I turned to sort of psychology around 2012. And so that's when I did my PhD in psychology and got more into psychoanalysis and qualitative research and critical psychology and all of that. So, yeah, I have my academic life and I have my artistic life, and my keyboard is right next to me for a reason.
It's amazing. And you also do film.
Yeah. So, independent filmmaker. I've directed, produced, and written 2 feature-length films and many short films.
Yeah. Great.
And you have a background in film too.
I do film. Yeah, I do film actually on mostly documentary, but I learned, I gained a trade sort of skill set in production. So I know how to produce a film, I know how to write a script and put all the pieces together in that regard. And it's crazy. It's good knowledge to have. It's good. I mean, part of me doesn't like film as a culture, because it's extremely it's extremely powerful medium, but it's so tedious and boring. When you're on a film shoot, for example, it takes up 99% of your mental energy. It's extremely, and there's much to be said. I mean,
yeah,
I like a lot of aspects of film, but it's hard to get into. The inner world of film is it's way more hierarchical than a religious organization.
Yeah.
And in a way it kind of has to be. But I respect what film can do as an artistic medium of expression, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, for me, the problem with filmmaking is really that it's expensive. Like, I enjoy theater and music more because it's much more affordable.
Yeah.
But actually, one of your films I used when I was at the University of West Georgia, which I think is called American Muslims: Fact versus Fiction. I think you produced that one. And
yeah,
I did a workshop where we screened it and then had a conversation around that film. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So let's actually kick off this conversation, Robert, with an analysis of Islamophobia. You've written, I think your first book was on kind of trying to push a new critical understanding of Islamophobia. And my first question is Islamophobia simply racism towards Muslims? Like, could we just call it that and sort of say, well, this is the form that racism takes when it comes to people being perceived as Muslim? Is that kind of what Islamophobia is for you?
I don't see it necessarily that way. So, I mean, sometimes scholars use the shorthand anti-Muslim racism to kind of simplify what it is. I think it's more complex than that. And so in my work, I conceive of it more as the othering and oppression of conceptual Muslims. And so that's kind of a key theoretical argument here. And so a conceptual Muslim is someone who's actually a Muslim or someone who is perceived to be Muslim looking. So that kind of umbrella term covers a lot of victims that experience Islamophobia who may not actually be Muslim. And so that's really what the phenomenon is about. It's not necessarily, obviously, a lot of Muslims experience Islamophobia, but then also a lot of non-Muslims. I mean, if you remember after 9/11, one of the first victims was a Sikh. So that's how Islamophobia works. It's more on this level of misperception, if you will.
Yeah, and it's actually was invented before 9/11 as a term by the state, by the British state, in a think tank. The Runnymede Report invented it, and I was interested because I feel like a lot of people think when they think of Islamophobia, they think about post 9/11 far right racism, but actually the more constant and more normalized version of Islamophobia is what Saba Mahmoud would call institutionalized Islamophobia or liberal Islamophobia. And that actually is more interesting to me in a way, right? Where it basically refers to the way in which, to use Saba Mahmoud's formulation, that Muslims can be included within networks of power and institutions, but on a disciplinary basis. Their inclusion is based on a dichotomy of good versus bad Muslim, for which they must either directly or indirectly deny, or rather take the side of being the good one. Yeah. So you can be a part of the liberal institutions and so on, from State Department to business, corporate life, etc. But your inclusion there is kind of comes at a price. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, what I want to mention here, so the Runnymede Report, I believe it was published in '97, popularized the term, but I really, in my work, I did a genealogy of the term, the concept, and the earliest instance I found was the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it was mostly in French writings about Muslim majority countries, and other than that, I make a distinction between Islamophobia as a discourse and Islamophobia as a fantasy. And so in terms of a discourse, I trace it back to Ronald Reagan, really. So in terms of how it's been tied with the war on terror, that specific connection. So to kind of back up a little bit, my specific interest to this, because, I was in Egypt. I lived in Egypt. I was born in Cairo, lived in Egypt till I was 24, then immigrated to the US. So I was in Egypt when the war in Iraq started. And that war had a big impact on my consciousness in terms of my political consciousness. And so when I thought about like the origin of my interest in this research topic, it starts there. But then another big point, which I write about in my first book, actually, when I was studying film, I did an MFA in film, and one time in the classroom, there was a screening of a short film that I was acting in, and I was actually in the film. I'm speaking in French. It's kind of a fun film that's referencing the French New Wave style of filmmaking, and I'm just reading quotes in French, and someone in the class said, "Oh wow, you look like a terrorist." Okay, so I was, first of all, like, I didn't know where this came from. I didn't understand the association. There's nothing in the film that's related to terrorism, right? And yet there was this association, and the person thought it was funny, That's the disturbing part. So this was a classmate.
Hmm.
And so I didn't really think about it deeply in the moment, but it took me years, especially after reading Fanon and, you know, reading about his experience on the train and the child that sort of interpolates him and positions him as, oh, you know, look, a Negro. And it felt like a similar moment to that. And I had to like think deeply about it. So what I was interested in really, and what I found under-theorized in the literature was the theoretical connection between the war on terror or terrorism discourse and Islamophobia. Like a lot of scholars assume that there's a connection, but they didn't really show what it is. And so that's why I had to get into the discourse and look back at Reagan. So because a lot of people, as you mentioned, tie it to 9/11 and George Bush, because he made it explicit with the war on terror. But Reagan really is the one that started the war on terror. And you can go back to see the origins of that. But that's one conversation. And then Islamophobia as a fantasy is much older. And I trace it back even to the 15th century. And we can get into that if you want.
Yeah. No, we should. This brings out Orientalism by Said, and I want to talk about the meaning of that text and that discourse. But even in the United States, like, you also have a kind of strange exotic form of Islamophilia. For example, in the American Revolutionary time, the founding fathers and so on, are you aware that the most popular book amongst the kind of literate classes was 1001 Nights? You know, and like there's all of this like Barnum and Bailey circus, you know, this iconic American, you know,
and Thomas Jefferson editing the Quran and all of that. Right?
Yeah, but like Barnum and Bailey's, they used Persian architecture, right? So there was this like, kind of long, strange history, and actually one of the first moments that American Islamophobia really sparks, I don't know if you're aware of this, is when the U.S. government goes to war against the Mormons, and the press referred to the Mormons as the Turks of America, or the Mohammedans of America.
Right.
This is a very strange genealogy, especially of American Islamophobic discourse, because, like it first starts as the Muslim becomes a object of pure irrational violence when you enter the war on terror, which occurs pre 9/11, right? It's kind of a post-Cold War thing. And then it evolves. And, you know, I've been engaged with this work for quite a while. And it's interesting that part of its evolution and also involved, you know, the myth of the Islamophobia industry, because one of the very interesting things about Islamophobia in the West is that it's bankrolled by far-right institutions, neo-fascist groups, libertarian groups, etc., some liberal as well. And they create certain, you know, they create a lot of propaganda that at certain moments in recent history has been extremely successful, which we could talk about that as well. But you're more interested, Robert, in kind of understanding the subjective. This is where the critical psychology and the psychoanalysis kind of comes into the picture, because you, in your first book, I liked how you combined Lacanian discourse theory with an analysis of the subjectivity of American Muslims. And you actually did that by some quantitative research and interviews. Qualitative. Thank you for that distinction. It's been many years since
important.
I took that class in grad school. I always mix those up. But anyways, so tell me about that. Like what drew you? I know you shared your personal experience that is helpful.
Yeah.
But what drew you to combining Lacanian psychoanalysis, especially Lacan's discourse theory, with, you know, with this understanding of the subjectivity of otherized Muslim people in the United States in particular?
Yeah. Well, so my training, as I mentioned earlier a little bit, is in critical psychology, which is basically looking at mainstream Euro-American psychology critically and critiquing it using different theoretical resources. So psychoanalysis is one of those. It's not the only one. You can do it from the perspective of phenomenology, feminism, Marxism, what have you. So there's that. And then qualitative research is the other piece of it. And so, I've worked with different qualitative research methods. Discourse analysis is one that really attracted me in general. And within that, because that's a whole world on its own, there are so many subtypes of discourse analysis. And so I've actually used different ones before Lacanian discourse analysis. But coming across the work of Ian Parker, because I was engaging with him. He's a British critical psychologist and Lacanian psychoanalyst who had a big influence on me. And so reading his work on Lacan, he developed pretty much Lacanian discourse analysis as a qualitative research method for critical psychology. Obviously, the basis of it is Lacan's Seminar 17, wherein he talks about the 4 discourses and all of that. But what Parker did was try to, flesh out the methodology further so that there's some kind of guideline of how to use it qualitatively and apply it in terms of analyzing interview transcripts. And so there's an empirical aspect to it. So basically, it was very attractive to me because, I was already into discourse analysis. I understood, the importance of language. And that's a big part of critiquing psychology because mainstream psychology will reduce subjectivity to one of 3 things. It will be the brain or the mind, but understood in terms of cognition, or behavior. So that's basically the typical mainstream psychological approach. And so critical approaches try to understand subjectivity in more complex ways. And one of the ways to do that is to kind of focus on language and discourse, right? And so that really appealed to me. And of course, it ties really well with the whole linguistic turn of the 20th century in philosophy and all of that. So, it's still an appealing approach to me.
Yeah.
The only limitation that I find, and where psychoanalysis had to be kind of emphasized a bit more, is this focus on fantasy specifically, because a lot of times you focus so much on discourse, and then the fantasy dimension also has to kind of be emphasized in the analysis. And then later in my work, what I tried to focus more on is kind of materiality, the question of materiality in relation to language and subjectivity. So that's kind of the evolution of my thinking on this.
Yeah, and you have obviously Frantz Fanon is probably the he's an interlocutor that's extremely significant for you. And I want to actually invite you to actually open up a bit of the Fanonian treasure chest of ideas that we've been given by Fanon. I think there's been quite a lot of really compelling stuff that's looking at post-colonial / decolonial studies that is kind of bridging Lacanian psychoanalysis with Fanonian insights. But Fanon's actually not the only figure that you pull from. Paulo Freire, Enrique Dussel is a very interesting figure to talk about here. There's many others, but let's get our bearings straight with Frantz Fanon. Black Skin, White Masks, Wretched of the Earth, and so on are widely read texts.
Right.
What does Fanon bring to the table for understanding this kind of racialized subjectivity that we're talking about here? What is Fanon's kind of contribution?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there are different Fanons, right? I mean, the Fanon of Black Skin, White Mask is different from the Fanon of the Damned of the Earth, right? The first one is more psychoanalytic, existential, phenomenological, and the second one is more Marxist, more revolutionary, right? Both are equally important, but in a way, they're 2 very different Fanons, different writing styles, different theorization. So the first one really, the first Fanon really attracts me because that's where I locate the beginning of what we can call decolonial psychoanalysis. And so, which is how to engage, and it's helpful here to talk about what that is, right? And so psychoanalysis is obviously a powerful tool. It's a powerful praxis. It's a science of the unconscious, and so something that cannot be dismissed or canceled. But at the same time, it's something that can be critiqued and should be critiqued, especially from a non-European perspective. Mainly because non-European subjects were not included necessarily um, in the theorization of psychoanalytic texts as modern subjects, and so that's important to me. That because we're excluded, that doesn't mean that we should ignore the whole thing, but we should try to think about what is our relationship to it and where do we locate ourselves. And that's what he does with that text. I see him struggling. He's coming from Martinique. He's in France. Growing up in Martinique, even though it's franchise colony of France, he did not experience the kind of racism that he experienced while he was in France, right? That's when he started actually realizing what racialization means, what it means to be Black, and all of that. So he's using the tools of the masters to analyze his experience while at the same time critiquing those tools. And that's basically what I see decolonial psychoanalysis doing. It's engaging with psychoanalysis seriously, using psychoanalytic thinking, but at the same time, there's this critical edge of what are the limitations here and how do we bring our own subjectivity and experiences to actually make psychoanalysis more worldly, in a sense, expanding it, stretching it. And he talks about that stretching. He talks about stretching Marxism. And there are similar critiques there too, in the sense of thinking of Marxism beyond Eurocentrism, thinking of it in a worldly fashion. So that's really the move. And that also is something that, you mentioned Enrique Dussel. He frames that in terms of transmodernity. And so, that whole modernity debate is a big one, and there are different critiques of it. He basically rejects the sort of critical modern approach, which I guess best exemplified by the Frankfurt schools, which is a critique from within. And he also critiques the postmodern kind of dismissal of modernity. He thinks that both are problematic, and both are ultimately Eurocentric. So they don't really know how to critique modernity from without, from an exterior perspective, from the periphery, from the global south, right? And so the transmodern move, and this I think I see also what Fanon is doing, is to how to save what's worth saving from modernity, while at the same time adding to it, synthesizing with it, things from without that were excluded by it. So that's the transmodern move. So really what it's canceling is the colonial aspect of modernity. That's the part that we want to throw away. And that's what I see Fanon doing and some of these other theorists that you mentioned is, it's not against reason, it's not against modernity, but it's against this colonial logic that undergirds modernity, that claims that modernity is, let's say, solely European, or there's an equivalence between modernity and Europeanness.
So Fanon himself was engaged in, like you said, the damned of the earth or wretched of the earth, although that's probably a better translation to say damned of the earth. I think
I prefer that,
yeah. Because in that text, it was a kind of manifesto which was extraordinarily influential in very concrete national uprising movements during the Cold War, not only in Africa, not only in, say, Algeria, but way beyond that.
Yeah, the third world.
Third world, broadly speaking, yeah. So time has passed, globalization, intensified finance capitalism, yet the global south, the third world, remains in much of the same material conditions. And what I want to ask you is, why Yusuf was Fanon himself already at that time a decolonial theorist? Like, what is the specificity historically of the term decolonial? Why not? Why do you not prefer to use post-colonial?
Okay, that's a big debate. Well, I make a different distinction. So there's post-colonial in terms of post-colonial nation states after decolonization. So there's that historical term. So basically, roughly around the end of World War II, all these nations that were actually franchise colonies, Egypt being one of them. Egypt was colonized by the UK, and then it became independent, so it became a post-colonial nation state, right? So there's that aspect, and that's an aspect that I critique, just because the material decolonization is important, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it leads to liberation. That's the distinction that I make. Then there's post-colonialism as a field of study that reflects on those issues. And then there's decoloniality, which is really an effort, mostly from Latin American scholars, who they see post-colonial studies or post-colonialism as very academic and not grounded enough in praxis. And so there's this split, and the split in a sense is also, to some extent, and I write about this, ethnic. You have the post-colonial theorists mostly being from Africa and Asia, the best representatives being Homi Bhabha, Spivak, and Edward Said. And then you have the Latin American decolonial theorists, such as Enrique Dussel, Huerta Mignolo, Ramon Grosfoguel, etc. So there's that. That doesn't really interest me as much, that kind of theoretical debate. What interests me is decoloniality. For me, it's connected to liberation. And so you can have material decolonization, and you can have a post-colonial nation state, and that's what we have in a lot of the global South. But we might still have the most ugly parasitic capitalism, right? We might still have police brutality. We might still have the worst kinds of oppression and violence, right? So that's why I don't see, there's a historical element to the post, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the undoing of coloniality and colonialism, the undoing of oppression and violence is there. So that's the distinction for me.
So then this necessitates the development of mass politics, politics of solidarity. I know you talk, I mean, it's interesting because I think for a lot of people that are interested in first coming at these discourses, they're going to ask, well, what is this a sort of identity politics kind of thing? And what's interesting, Robert, and I want to invite you to talk about this, is you have a very sophisticated reading of how identity plays into all of these dynamics. And you talk, for example, about how even in Fanon's thought, the idea of non-identity is important.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, in a way, you're sort of taking the category of identity so seriously and rigorously that you end up beyond it. And you also, for example, like to invoke the important notion that Jody Dean develops of seeing one another in relation of the comrade.
Yeah.
So at this point, can you address the identity piece, which I think because there's a geographical problem there, which is in United States discourse, it means something very, very different than it does in these other milieus. I mean, if anyone that's an American, let's say you're a white American and you travel to what they used to call third world or global South, it's actually so different, the dynamic, the way you're treated, like the way that like whiteness functions as a currency, as a symbolic signifier, is so different. And so there's this kind of thing, this maybe we could call the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And say a few things about that, please.
Well, for me, as you mentioned, like I write about non-identity politics, which to me means an identity based in politics as opposed to a politics based in identity. And so what that means is the problem of identity politics is the problem of identification, which is the problem of any attractive, seductive, nationalist type of politics where there's a charismatic leader that we identify with. So that's for me the problem of identity politics is that we find someone that we think looks like us, represents us, and then we identify with this person. And then, I mean, look at all the historical examples where that goes wrong. So for me, and this is where psychoanalysis is helpful, because, you know, obviously identification is always on an imaginary level, right? It's the realm of images. It's looking at others in that way. But what's more important, I think, politically speaking, is the question of desire and enjoyment. And so we have to ask ourselves as political subjects, what is it that we want collectively, and what is it that we would enjoy collectively? And those are more important questions to me than the question of identification.
That's extremely helpful and very radical. It's and that kind of is where Lacan comes in for you, right? With the emphasis on kind of politics ultimately has to do with a kind of subjective relation to enjoyment, and enjoyment is not to be understood purely as a kind of something that we find pleasurable, but as a kind of more a more situated or broader way of life, or sort of things of that nature. And so say a little bit more about that. How does the Lacanian emphasis on fantasy, desire, enjoyment, etc., how is that functioning here? Or yeah, how do you kind of make that case?
Okay, I think one thing that's helpful, so in Freud and Said, I talk about the apparatus of racial capitalism, because that's pretty much like a Cartesian coordinate system that we're all positioned by. So it's you know, imagine a Cartesian coordinate system, like an X and Y axes, and basically we're interpolated in that hierarchical model to be somewhere in there. And so at the top of that, I see sexual difference. And so sexual difference as, in a way, the regime that distinguishes, you know, masculine enjoyment from feminine enjoyment, which obviously, historically speaking, favors the phallic enjoyment, right? And so, and that's why the feminist critiques are important here, to kind of question that and problematize that. And, you know, Lacan obviously was, his intervention is helpful here in terms of mapping it this way, so that we can think about what this feminine enjoyment entails, right? This enjoyment of the other. And so there's that element. And my intervention is, I see that this is, historically speaking, an important structural differentiation, especially for European modernity. But it does not really account for the experiences of racialized, oppressed folks, especially non-European subjects. And so that's why I kind of introduced this notion of colonial difference. So a different two other modes of enjoyment. And so there's, and here I kind of combine a little bit of Lacan with Walter Benjamin. And so there's the mythic enjoyment of coloniality, which is an enjoyment based in violence and oppression, as far as I see it. And you can see how it maps over racism and all forms of oppressions that we see. And then there's a possibility of another type of enjoyment, which is not explored as much, but it's there, which is what I would call divine enjoyment. We can think of it as more connected with liberation and trying to think about a world. And this is, I guess, with the notion of divine violence, which has so many interpretations. What that means, it's very open, because some can interpret it as non-violence, or a kind of violence that's revolutionary, but not in a typical way. So that's a whole other thing. So I see, what I'm hoping to see is that how can we, all of us are situated within the apparatus of racial capitalism. No one is outside of it, right? There's no meta language. So all of our critiques are still from within. But what I try to do is just describe it in such a way that I include the experience of the racialized, the damned, the oppressed, and in relation to sexual difference, right? And so colonial difference is the difference between human and non-human, which is a distinction that obviously historically played an important role in the development of race and racism and all of that.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have to also talk about that, not just masculine, feminine enjoyment.
So yeah, so let's unpack some of this. This is very helpful. So there's a kind of mythic structure of enjoyment, which you identify as coming from a kind of capitalist European cultural source of sort of power and imposition, and then there is you juxtapose that with divine jouissance or divine enjoyment, which you could say is a sort of both a way of a way out of that problematic, but also a way of theorizing maybe a different kind of structuring principles of enjoyment. That's really fascinating. So how does mythic enjoyment actually kind of impose? Like, what are the kind of coordinates of that imposition? Does that mean that, like, kind of that it forces all subjects within the sphere of its apparatus and so on, that it forces all subjects to abide by a certain way of enjoying and then creates prohibitions around deviations from that norm? Is it kind of like that? Or how do you unpack this kind of mythic?
Yeah, well, the mythic enjoyment is the enjoyment that's made possible by, you know, colonization, enslavement, and all of its effects that we experience to this day. And so, I mean, if you want to think about it in terms of a capitalist, like an political economic analysis, think about the kind of accumulation that allowed for the Industrial Revolution to happen, right? And the role of slavery in that. And so the kind of extraction that's based on this kind of very oppressive and violent enjoyment. So slavery can be abolished, but the mode doesn't change. It just finds other ways of extraction and, you know, surplus enjoyment and all of that. But that's why we still struggle with racism in society. That's why we still see all these forms of oppression, because whether we are directly complicit or indirectly benefiting from the system, it's a system that its enjoyment is based on violence and oppression. And, you know, you see it in terms of wars, you see it in terms of all these modes of extraction, and so, you know, we like to tell ourselves that we're more progressive, but this is just a lie. We don't want to face this kind of very tragic form of enjoyment, right? And so obviously it's important to say that it's not the only enjoyment out there, and that's why I talk about this divine enjoyment, which, you know, if you think about the experience in the US, the kind of aesthetics that is produced from the African American experience, right? With the spirituals and all forms of artistic expression and music and in other ways, in spite of all the suffering and the struggle, how to sublimate that and turn it into something aesthetic that's enjoyable in a different mode completely.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's very fascinating to me. I mean, I just wrote a book where I offered a critique of Deleuze and Guattari. And, you know, one of the things, though, that I will say about the way that those two philosophers, both kind of influenced by Lacan, one of the interesting ways that they spoke about racial subjectivity that would strike a little differently if they were to write about it today, which is that, you know, when they met, for example, with the Black Panthers, when it came to the United States on their tour, they often would refer to their own solidarity with the Black struggle in ways which we would see today as a bit cringe-worthy, in the sense that even for them, even though they're kind of white, heteronormative European men, right? Those taboos didn't exist on the discourse, so they could actually speak about a kind of minoritas or minor form of subjectivity, which they can have a solidarity with. So in a way, they had their own revolutionary theory for how anyone can inhabit that kind of black radical subjectivity in a certain sense. Whereas today, I sense, Robert, and I wonder if you agree, that one of the challenges we're facing is actually how you might foster a discourse where creative solidarities cross-racial, cross-class, cross-ethnic, cross-religious, etc., can be done in such a way that you're not affirming liberal corporate identity politics on accident. Because I think that sometimes well-meaning people can actually end up with a discourse where actually what ends up effectively happening is a solidarity which can be co-opted by elites, by powerful institutions, and we've seen a lot of that. Can you speak a little bit about those kinds of questions? Because, you know, racial capitalism is a real thing, and it requires an analysis of it. Yet at the same time, there's very elite forces, including the Federal Reserve and all the major corporations, that can come in and kind of, you know, take hold,
co-opt and sell us back some of those things.
Yeah, and a lot of people are realizing that. So what do you say to that?
I mean, this is the million-dollar question. So given that what we're dealing with is this apparatus of racial capitalism, obviously our solidarity, our praxis has to be grounded in anti-racism and anti-capitalism. There is no other way. One thing that inspires me about, you mentioned Paulo Freire, and he's a thinker that I really enjoy engaging with. And so for him, you know, like there are different models, obviously, of revolution, but for him, revolution, in a sense, is it's not something. It's not an event. It's a process, right? So it's always happening, and it can always happen, right? It's not just one event where here's the revolution, it happened, and then things have change after that. And we know from history as well that revolutions can happen, things can improve a little bit, but then, you know, people hold power, you have state power, you have state capitalism, and then just recreating same modes of oppression and violence. And so I think we have to let go of that to some extent. I think that's kind of, in my opinion, outdated to try to think that, you know, just by putting the right people in power that things can be better. And that's a bit of the trap of identity politics, is that we're looking for the leaders that will save us, right? Instead, I think we should you know, think of the praxis of revolution on a daily basis in our relationships with one another, and what we do, and the ways we speak to one another, and what we put out there in the world. And then there's a long-term effect for that, you know. Now, of course, there will be critiques of coming saying, well, what about revolutionary violence and that kind of, you know, that's a whole big debate, right? I definitely, Walter Benjamin informs my thinking here, because when he talks about divine violence, he does give a very concrete example of the proletarian general strike as a form of divine violence, and I really like that. And so the kind of violence, and we can think about the Egyptian uprising of 2011 in this context. A lot of people like to think of the image of Tahrir Square because it's, you know, aesthetically appealing, but that's not really the key moment. The key moment was when workers went on strike behind the scenes and were not televised, and the whole state apparatus collapsed because of that. The losses in terms of, for the capitalists, in terms of millions, that led to the army to pressure Mubarak to step down, because, you know, the state will collapse completely if the workers don't go to work. And so they were like, you have to step down. But that's not televised. That's not like the image that will be on Wikipedia. That's not what people will be talking about. But that's really where the, you know, rubber hits the road.
Yeah. No, it's almost like the proletarian position needs to be 10 times more adequate and more sophisticated in the way it speaks about racial capitalism than the liberal progressives and the elites are, because they can speak about it too, right? But I want to actually read a quote from your book on Freud and Said, where you say, we are not comrades because we are the same, but because despite our differences, we may share common interests. The paradox is that under racialized capitalism, not only is violence normalized, everything is individualized. In contrast, the subject of psychoanalysis, with its singularity of being, provides a necessary departure from both individualism and collectivism. The subject of the unconscious is a psychosocial subject who transcends the particularities of filiative identifications into a pluriversal, affirmative realm. As such, solidarity is not reducible to identity politics. I like that a lot. It's a nice thing. And you're using here Jody Dean's concept of the comrade with this subject of psychoanalysis.
This is why psychoanalysis is important. And by the way, related to this, you know, Freire talks about the importance of dialogue for revolutionary praxis, and he grounds dialogue in love, and he thinks of love as a revolutionary force, and I do too. And he distinguishes between dialogue and mere verbalism or chatter. So for him, you know, words without action, that's not dialogue. And he's also saying that action without words, he calls it activism, is not praxis. And so, and this is very key for psychoanalysis, because at the end of the day, you know, all we have is free association. And free association is a beautiful phrase because it means speaking freely, but it also meaning freely associating with other comrades. It has those both meanings.
Yeah,
and so yeah, and that's very crucial, and that speaks to dialogue, that speaks to love, that speaks to comradeship.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's not there. A lot of times what you see on social media is very emotional debates and screaming. And of course, this works in favor of the elites because they want us divided, right? They don't want us to be in solidarity.
Yeah.
They don't want us to be in dialogue.
Exactly.
They don't want us to be in love.
Yeah, it's like the anti-identity politics chorus on the left can actually paradoxically just reproduce a more resentful form of identity politics. So you have to treat these things that like very carefully and very, very, very well, and show that in a way your commitment to liberation and emancipation is more serious than the people that are in power than they claim theirs is.
And you know, another thing to add, this is important also to mention, because you know, Freire writes about the oppressor-oppressed relationship, that dialectical relationship, which not just a class thing. It does have the class antagonism dimension, but it also has the dimension of sexual oppression. It also has the dimension of racial oppression. So it's all couched into that. But his point is liberation is collective. It's a praxis, and it's truly collective in the sense that the oppressors must be liberated as well. And that's important because sometimes there's also a discourse of like killing the oppressors, or, you know, F the oppressors. But like, if we're dedicated to humanism, there are no exceptions. And I know that could be controversial because people will think of the exceptions. But the problem of the system that we have today, it's always based on the exception. It's like, who is human and who's not human. So if we reject that, we can't have exceptions. And so it has to be the humanization of all. I don't see another way.
I think that reminds me of something that Eldridge Cleaver, one of the early Black Panthers, said. He said that the white industrial proletariat in America will become lumpenized. They'll become more lumpen proletariat, and that he said that the Black population can teach. They can offer something because they've been sub-proletarian much longer.
Yeah.
And then in a way, like if you look at Clyde Barrow's new book on lumpen proletariat, which I highly recommend to everyone, we had Clyde on our channel. He says, well, Trumpism was kind of the coming home to roost of that prophetic insight that Eldridge Cleaver had. But the problem is because we don't have any class consciousness, none of that, you know, disenfranchised white sub-proletariat is going to see themselves that way. And that actually goes to racial capitalism itself,
right?
Because racial capitalism would harm the sub-proletarian white worker, or even worker / non-worker ejected from work, because it would still allow them to use this kind of fantasy. They could relate to the fantasy of something more material than they have available to them.
Right.
And that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy.
Well, that's how whiteness was invented, right? I mean, it's to fulfill that, to make sure there's no solidarity with blacks and indigenous folks, so that solidarity is on the basis of race as opposed to class, right?
It's extremely masochistic. I mean, the Free Soil Party and the Know Nothing Party that founded the Republican Party, that kind of combination there, I think in 1830s, 32, if I'm not mistaken, was itself trying to offer a way out of poverty for disenfranchised white people through racism, right? Through
right,
forging a solidarity with the bourgeois white industrial business class, with the lower stratum of the white class, saying we'll give you a leg up over the blacks. And that's
and Du Bois, of course, explores that in Black Reconstruction. I mean, he does a beautiful job.
It's enough. I mean, if you study enough Marxism, it's enough to make you so angered in reality. And I think we need to avoid those Marxists that say, well, we don't even need to talk about race or capitalism because it's all capitalism. Just, well, not in its evolution, you know, not in its evolution has been involved with this very specific racial strategy. And it's extremely disingenuous and masochistic, and has to be addressed, you know, head on.
And Aníbal Quijano is helpful here because, you know, his model of the coloniality of power, it centers the labor relations, but also how race was invented to manage populations. So that's important to.
Can you restate the name of that author?
Aníbal Quijano, Peruvian theorist. So he has important writings on modernity and coloniality, and so yeah, for me, at the end of the day, we have to look at all forms of oppression, especially ones that produce hierarchies that live on violence and oppression. So that's the bottom line. And that includes class struggles, that includes sexual oppression, that includes racism. So we have to be very clear that, you know, we're not going to prioritize one. We have to be against all, right?
No, it's really, really nice. So Edward Said we miss Edward Said. I mean, it just in the discourse, you know, in the kind of, he was, for folks that may be too young to remember, I'm old enough to remember when he and Chomsky and Howard Zinn would give these public talks and lectures on U.S. imperialism and, you know, Israel-Palestine stuff. And he had a moral conscience. He had a sophistication in literature, which was global and cosmopolitan, and he had an authority, academic authority. Even the elites could not mess with him in a way, in a certain way, right?
And he's also one of the most misunderstood figures.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so a lot of people reduce him to Orientalism, typically, to that text, which is obviously an important text. So there's that, this kind of post-colonial reduction to that specific text, and in a way negating all of his praxis and activism for the Palestinian struggle. I mean, he was on the Palestinian National Council, and he was engaged in that for years and worked directly with Yasser Arafat, and he left when, you know, just before the Oslo Accords. So so that, and then also I think a lot of Marxists just have a very kind of stereotypical understanding of him as just someone that hates Marxism and sees it as Eurocentric, and that's it. That's not a very nuanced take. And at the same time, when I bring him into psychoanalytic circles, a lot of people just dismiss him as, oh, he's just Foucauldian. He's not really into psychoanalysis. So these are like common misunderstandings. They don't know how. I mean, this man pretty much was one of the key figures that introduced French theory to the United States. Okay, and you know, in the early 70s, he had key essays on you know, bringing in Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, and his second book, which is in a way his first major book, Beginnings, which I write about in Freud and Said, you see like a really strong engagement with psychoanalysis, particularly the interpretation of dreams, you know, and Freud. And so, you know, Orientalism was such a monumental text that it overshadowed almost everything he did before or after.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. In other words, you don't need to read Said as dogmatically endorsing Foucauldianism or dogmatically having a position of a kind of, I don't know, like an anti-Marxist position.
Not.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, and keep in mind, as a literary critic, you should remember, and I saw this in the new biography of Edward Said. Did you know that Lukács was actually one of Edward Said's heroes?
Yeah. And also, and something in that same book, on the Palestinian National Council, which had different parties, he was his affiliation was with the more leftist revolutionary element in the Palestinian politics, the Democratic Front. So, I mean, the reality, the praxis speaks louder than any arguments. And of course, he loved Gramsci too. I mean, that's even clear in Orientalism, right?
Yeah. And Orientalism spawned in an industry, right? So in a way, he's not responsible for what it became, and that's actually a big question with scholarship as such. Like I'm writing a book on Nietzsche right now, but in reality, I'm writing more a book on Nietzscheanism than Nietzsche.
The effect.
The effect. And can you talk about how Edward Said was to give a lecture at the Freud Vienna Society, and they said, nope, we're not going to have you give the lecture because there's the image of you throwing the stone.
That's funny, because that image is similar to like the Will Smith incident in a way. Like
it's the iconic.
Yeah, like one image that ends up being super exaggerated. It becomes a metaphor for everything. And that becomes violence as opposed to the actual violence that's happening behind the scenes, right? So I mean, he was
that's the secret of Edward. That's the secret. He's really
so he
really
was
a divine violence guy.
Yeah,
really
he was he was in Lebanon, I think, and this was this picture. I think the Israeli embassy was abandoned. And he was celebrating that, and they were throwing rocks at the embassy, but there was no one there. It's like throwing rocks at a building. But like just the image.
And he said it was a pebble.
Yeah. It was. I mean, that whole practice. I mean, think about it. Like, you have the dispossession of Palestinian folks and their towns and villages, and you know, the actual history of violence and tragedy, and then that one image of a person that's hated and you know, the political unconscious associated with terrorism just because of his identity, just throwing a pebble or a rock at an abandoned building, that becomes the, you know, the exemplification of violence. So it was a stupid decision from the Freud Museum in Vienna. And honestly, I did an event recently with the Freud Museum, and the current president of the Freud Museum Vienna was very ashamed that this happened, and she apologized and on behalf of the museum, and they regret doing this. But that's worse things happen, like the cancellation of his talk, but some people lose their careers over this stuff.
Yeah. Said, let's talk about Said's ideas for a moment, because one in idea that you pull from him, and which is not really a Foucauldian idea, because he was a humanist, right? And Foucault is talking about death of man and death of the author. It's very different. Says Said is, the core of humanism is the secular notion that the historical world is made by men and women and not by God, and that it can be understood rationally. So Edward Said actually has a commitment to that tradition, to the humanist tradition, but in a critical way. Can you? And again, that's not really Foucauldian. So he's a very complex.
He was struggling. I think what attracted to him about Foucault was the methodology. I mean, that's the bottom line. And Foucault influenced a lot of people that way, even Lacan. I mean, when I looked at the sort of if you look at Seminar 17 and the publication of Archaeology of Knowledge, you'll understand how this seminar is kind of in dialogue with that book, right? And so his notion of discourse is not something to be dismissed. It's obviously very influential, and he's very good that way in terms of presenting a methodology. But that doesn't mean that you have to accept his whole philosophy. And I think that's what Said struggled with, is that he liked the methodology of like looking at archives and doing discourse analysis, but he also didn't like the idea that we're just going to look at discourses and subjects are mere effects of discourses, that they have no agency. He didn't like that. And he's very clear about that. So that's why he's not a full-on Foucauldian. He's a Foucauldian in that text with some reservation. And again, if you go to the previous text, Beginnings, you see the strong engagement with psychoanalysis, and he prefers that theorization of subjectivity over the Foucauldian one. And that's why after Orientalism, he kind of abandons Foucault, never really cites him again. And when he does, he kind of, he basically rejects him. So I show that in the book, that when he later is asked about Foucault, he's like, there's nothing really that was helpful for me in Foucault. I found much more helpful insights from Fanon and Cabral and others. And so, again, people just reduce him to that one text. They didn't want us to see the evolution of his thinking and all of that. And of course, he wrote a sequel to Orientalism, which is Culture and Imperialism, which is a very different text. He does all the things that he was critiqued for in Orientalism. So he was critiqued that you did a really good analysis of how Europeans represent the Orient, and you deconstructed that, but then what about how the Orientals represent themselves? Where is that? So that was the main critique of Orientalism. So he was like, his answer to that was Culture and Imperialism, right? That actually Orientals represent themselves culturally, and that's a form of resistance. And it's connected very much to the actual resistance that's happening on the ground, because you definitely need the cultural element too. And the other thing too that I argue is that Freud is repressed in Orientalism. And that's a very interesting argument to think about, because Freud is mentioned 3 times in the text, literally 3 references. However, the shadow or the ghost of Freud is very strong in the text. So there's a whole chapter called Latent and Manifest Orientalism. And as someone that engages with psychoanalysis, you can already know where that's coming from. Right? The interpretation of dreams. He's actually using, so the methodology of dream interpretation is there in Orientalism, but it's like in a ghostly fashion. So in a way, there's a tension in the text between the Foucauldian methodology, which is implicit, and this kind of unconscious analysis, which draws on Freud. And in this way, his repression of Freud reaffirms his sort of conviction that psychoanalysis is a better theory. Wow. So so that's kind of what I noticed, and I was like blown away by that.
And let's talk about his intervention, his lecture called Freud and the Non-European, which came towards the latter part of his life, and it's a examination of Moses and monotheism. And some of and actually the insights of Moses and monotheism are extremely, extremely significant, especially as it pertains to this question we're having around identity.
Absolutely.
Talk about this lecture and its importance.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's Said's last book, which is on Freud's last book, and both men died of cancer, and so that's interesting to kind of think about that. He uses it as an example of late style, which is a concept that he uses, and it's his actualization of late style with that text as well, or talk, because it's transcribed. So Moses and Monotheism is a very interesting text because Freud argues that Moses was Egyptian, and that's kind of a very radical argument, because that's basically making the argument that, you know, the foundation of Jewish identity is non-Jewish, which is my point about nine identity politics, because identity politics in a way is essentialist. Like there's some kind of essence holding the identity, but when you get to the bottom of it, what's holding the identity is actually non-identity, and that's a very radical point that Freud is making there, and Said draws that out and fleshes it in his talk, to talk about obviously the Israel-Palestine conflict, and how Freud's theorization actually presents us with a path forward beyond this conflict, when we actually don't think, and you know, as that these are clashes of civilizations or something like that, like Huntington, but actually that when they realize that what they have in common is non-identity, then they probably will stop fighting, right? It's only when you say I am this and you're that, and we're very separate and it's very concrete, but it's actually completely an illusion and a fantasy. That's why the clash continues. It's a clash of fantasies, in other words. But also significantly, so he was writing this text, and then the Nazi annexation of Austria happened as he was working on it. Right. Of course, he was very sick and all that, so he had to find a way to get to outside of Austria with his family, and he ended up in England, and then he wrote the second part of the book from there. So that whole disruption of the text by, you know, the Nazi annexation is also very interesting, because it's the text where he addresses or thinks about anti-Semitism in the most direct way. I mean, it's, you know, he didn't really reflect a lot on his Jewish heritage, so in a way it was kind of a repressed thing, and then here he is directly facing it head on and thinking about anti-Semitism and all of that. So it's very important for us today in terms of thinking about racism and all forms of oppression to look back at this text. It's urgent. It's an urgent test.
I really like that. And the book is also a theory. Moses and Monotheism also discusses this idea that the religious community is founded on the murder of the primal father, but it's number one, and that this actually, according to Freud, was repressed. So the horror of that founding act of the Jewish community was repressed, but in that repression, and this I think is the interesting point, he says that the Jews harnessed, and this is why repression is not to be understood necessarily as only negative, but rather that they harnessed and cultivated a sense of artistic and scientific advancement amongst the community. And that's what by the latency of that repression, that it kind of has a certain creative tension in a certain sense.
So
very interesting point. And the other interesting point I really like about it is that the foundation of a community is founded by the stranger. And of course, Robert, it's interesting to make a comparison, and I want to see what you think about this, to Fethi Ben Slama's argument that Islam is founded by Hajar, and that Hajar functions in a way as the other, or the stranger, to the foundation of the Islamic community. So we can talk about that later. That's something I want to raise with you.
I mean, so what you said about the primordial father and all that, so obviously Moses and Monotheism is a sequel to Totem and Taboo, and he was writing it that way. but some things that we didn't mention, just to make sure that it's out there. So he makes the argument, Freud, that there are two Moseses, not one, and that one is, and so there's the Moses, the Egyptian Moses, and there's another Moses that in the Exodus that the Jews come across, more like in the Arabian Peninsula, and the two characters had very different philosophies. So the Egyptian Moses was more influenced by Akhenaten and his monotheistic religion of Atenism, the worship of one deity represented by the sun's energy. So basically as the sun as the source of life, but not as an object. So there's that, and he says that that's really the foundation of monotheism and this idea of an abstract God, and that's appealing because it's very intellectual pursuit of Maat, M-A-A-T, which in ancient Egypt means truth and justice. So it's like concept that combines those two in one. So he's really attracted to that part of the heritage, and the other part, the other Moses, worshipped some kind of volcanic god who's angry, like a volcano, right? And so basically the god that ends up being created is a combination of those two, kind of an intellectual god, but also like a volcanic angry god. And he's trying to resuscitate the intellectual one, and that's for him his point there. So that's the one that was killed, and in a sense, I guess this ties in also to fundamentalism and secularization, in the sense that the literal approach to religion connects to the second version more, like the angry god, the kind of anthropomorphic god, right? That looks like us, as opposed to the more abstract version that represents something we can't personally relate to, but represents certain concepts, and the kind of God that's closer to philosophy, if you will, and psychoanalysis as intellectual pursuits, right?
Yeah, thanks for that distinction. It's really, really fascinating. What do you make of Ben Slama's? He wrote a book called Islam and the Challenge of Psychoanalysis, and he wrote it kind of, and I've actually spoke with Nadia Bouali on this program about her opinion about Ben Slama's work. He's a Lacanian psychoanalyst. He's very, very, very secular. He's French.
Right.
He has the opinion that basically the fundamentalist subject of contemporary Muslim life, and he really kind of blankets that, I think, a bit too much.
Yeah.
Is a subject of perversion, but he also does this kind of exegetical analysis of the Quran and of the Islamic holy scriptures, and locates the founder, or the kind of the stranger at the foundation, because again it is this principle of non-identity.
Yeah,
locates that in the drama of Hajar, who was the concubine of Sarah.
Yeah.
I don't know if folks are familiar with that narrative from the Quran. And then, of course, you have the whole split there with Isaac and Ishmael, and the differences between how the Jews and the Christians read the Isaac Ishmael thing differently than the Muslims.
Yeah.
So there's a whole narrative there which we could probably elucidate. But my question to you is sort of, what do you make of that psychoanalytic reading, of the Islam origin story? Do you buy it? Do you think it's problematic?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my approach. So what I'm not an Islamic studies scholar, obviously. What I was interested in was to interview U.S. Muslims and explore their subjectivities through discourse and thinking psychoanalytically about what they're saying. So that's what I'm interested in, kind of grounding my thinking in something more empirical. And so a lot of my thinking is based in that. And so I don't use psychoanalysis to analyze Islam personally. And so, for example, I think I mentioned this to you before. There was this really important conference that I attended in 2017, organized by Ian Parker and Sabah Siddiqui. It was called Islamic Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Islam. This was in the spring of 2017 at the University of Manchester. And I presented there, and I had to think, I was very attracted to the idea, like the relationship between Islam and psychoanalysis. And this was the first time that I saw it in conference format as a call for papers. So I thought about it, and it's tempting to go that route of like using psychoanalysis to think about Islam, and I'm not against it. But what I was more interested in concretely, and that's what I ended up writing about, is how psychoanalysis can help us think about Islamophobia and analyze it, and also ultimately to move beyond that, right? And so my entry point to that was kind of looking at if there were any psychoanalytic writings on that. And that's how I came across your work. I came across Zizek's work on Islamophobia. I found it, to be honest, and I admire him, but I found it sloppy and under-theorized. And he has writing on Islam's that are better than that, but Against the Double Blackmail, that book, which is not one of his best, but he basically, his argument about Islamophobia was similar to the conservative right-wing angle. That Islamophobia is a term that limits free speech, right? So every time that term comes up, that means that we can't talk about Islam or Muslims. And that's not what Islamophobia is. Islamophobia is about as I mentioned, the othering and oppression of conceptual Muslims. So what's funny here is that term conceptual Muslim is actually inspired by Zizek, because in The Plague of Fantasies, he talks about the conceptual Jew in his theorization of anti-Semitism. And he has a very, very strong writings there about fantasy. And so I was surprised why he's good at analyzing anti-Semitism, but not Islamophobia, when they're quite similar in many ways. And so that's really my project. I don't want to talk about something.
That tracks. No, it's been an interest of mine. I'm not an Islamic studies scholar myself, although I have a strong interest in reading in that area. Although it's not my training, I'm much more personally trained in critical theory and continental philosophy and Lacanian psychoanalysis. But I will say this: I feel like it's one of those things. So like take Freud. Freud is not a theologian of the Talmud, right? But he's Jewish. Okay,
right.
He can intervene there and say something from the standpoint of the founder of psychoanalysis and from a psychoanalytic standpoint. And Ben Slamat interests me because he's trying to kind of do something similar.
Right.
Okay, in reality, psychoanalysis in the Muslim world is a real thing. There's all kinds of clinics and analysts, right? And the culture has been infused with psychoanalysis for decades.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just wondering, like, as a theological intervention, maybe in your analysis of Muslim subjective life, maybe the way in which sacred narratives, putting aside the exegetical question of like, okay, let's examine, because I
can tell you what I found empirically from my interviews, because that might interest you. So one thing, like this notion of code switching. So there's that, but something much more significant happens. So, in U.S. Muslim subjectivity, in those interviews, when I asked the participants about their experiences and accounts of Islamophobia, as well as how they resisted. So I was interested because, I looked at the psychological literature, and it was basically one, quantitative mostly, coming from a kind of mainstream psychological perspective, but also there's this notion of coping a lot, coping with Islamophobia, as if it's something we should live with. You know what I mean? I hated that term. I wanted to think more like, how do we resist it? I don't want to cope with Islamophobia. No one should, but that's there in the actual academic literature. Another thing was a lot of the studies were interviewing white folks and seeing if they're Islamophobic or not. So basically, the Muslim voice was absent. The Muslim subjectivity, the Muslim experience, right? And I don't want to speak for US Muslims. I wanted to interview them so that you can see them speaking for themselves. And that's what you see in Decolonial Psychoanalysis, that first book, is you see a lot of transcripts. And some people give me really nice feedback after reading that, saying that reading those transcripts helped them listen better or listen differently. And so one of the things that were like stood out to me was that code switching between the US identity and the Muslim subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
And so when they're thinking about themselves as US citizens and talking from that perspective, they're internalizing the war on terror discourse and Islamophobia. When they switch to the Muslim subjectivity, they're very critical of that whole discourse and that whole fantasy. And so it's stronger than code switching. I see it almost as a subjective switch. And so obviously when they switch to the Muslim subjectivity, Arabic becomes more prominent in the interviews. And so, you know, my ability to speak that as my first language was helpful. So I can transcribe that and think about it. And not only do you get the Arabic, you also get concepts from Islam as well. So that's my engagement with it, like at that level, which is the level of subjectivity. And that's again what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think it's really good. I think you maybe what would be needed in the future is something that could combine something more with more integrity than Ben Slama brings to the table, because I think Ben Slama's discourse is founded, maybe we could say, Robert, in a kind of anti-Islam orientation in a way, right?
Right.
But what would it look like if you had a really rigorous psychoanalytic commitment combined with a rigorous theological understanding of the tradition?
Right, as opposed to a dismissive approach, right?
Exactly. So I feel like that would be quite interesting, because I mean the other famous figure is Mustafa Safon, and he's Egyptian,
right?
But you know, I mean, I feel like his work is another example of something which is so militantly secular in orientation that it kind of, and maybe this is an opportunity for you to speak about the book you recently translated.
Yeah, absolutely.
By Wahba, and how does that play out? Like, what is this idea of fundamentalism? We don't hear it too much anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start with breaking that down. It's a very unfortunate framework. To even, or rather, it's just too nebulous. Fundamentalism. What do you?
Well, so that book was published in Arabic in 1995, and when I was actually doing research for the paper I presented at that 2017 conference, that's when I came across that book, and I was reading it, translating excerpts from it, and I was fascinated by Murad Wahba's theorization of the dialectical relationship between parasitic capitalism and all forms of fundamentalism. That you wouldn't have fundamentalism if you didn't have capitalism. Like, he found that there's a theoretical link between the two. And so that's really what he does. He does a genealogy of the concept and then shows how it works and with capitalism and all of that. For him, the key theorist of fundamentalism in his perspective is Edmund Burke. The book on the French Revolution, where he's being critical of it, and he's, you know, from a British perspective, worried that this could spread into the UK, and, you know, it would be problematic. So in that sense, Wahba puts secularization on the side of revolution and puts fundamentalism on this side.
So then Burke would be a fundamentalist of the fundamentalist persuasion.
He thinks of him as a major theorist of fundamentalism, yeah.
So does that mean that fundamentalism is kind of synonymous with reactionary thought?
Yeah, like conservatism. So I think, you know, if we think of like this kind of trifecta of like radicalism, liberalism, conservatism. So he sees fundamentalism as a conservative phenomenon that's supported by liberalism through capitalism. So basically, he ties the two together in that way. and that radicalism or revolutionary thought is more on the side of democracy and secularization. So that's the distinction that he draws. He puts also postmodernism on the side of the conservative side as well.
Why?
So basically, for him, fundamentalism is a claim about the absolute truth. So what it is and who has access to it, and he's a relativist from an epistemic perspective, and so he doesn't deny that there might be absolute truth. It's just he has a problem with people claiming that they have access to it and then working from there. And so that's the basis for any kind of dogmatic approach. The other argument that he makes that's kind of a cornerstone of fundamentalism is like a literalist approach. So any kind of literalist approach that doesn't allow for interpretation. So again, what appeals to me about psychoanalysis is basically that, you know, you can have multiple interpretations of any text, right? Psychoanalysis will never make the claim that there's one interpretation, right? Whereas fundamentalists or dogmatists, and the two are the same for him, will make the claim that there is one single interpretation and that there's the literalist one. Again, if you see the struggles today that we have politically, you can also map it out in that way. Another thing that he does that's really helpful, he traces the genealogy of what we call the alt-right today. So he shows their origins in the New Right in the 80s, right? Jerry Falwell and the moral majority movement. People forget about that, but you wouldn't have the alt-right if you didn't have the New Right in the 80s, right? So, and of course, what we see with Trump is repeating a lot of Reagan's discourses to the extent that he's repeating the actual campaign slogan. Reagan said, "Let's make America great." And Trump didn't come up with a new idea. He just repeated that, you know, he's just a worse version of Reagan, or like a cheap version of Reagan, right? So that's really a key point of analysis for him during the Cold War, thinking about that and the rise of the right in that context. Another thing that I link in his work, I don't know if you like Adam Curtis, so you probably saw The Power of Nightmares.
Yeah.
That's a powerful movie that in a way echoes a lot of Wahhabist arguments, because in the movie Curtis shows that Muslim fundamentalists and new conservatives have a lot in common, and that basically they have like this very interesting organic dialectical relationship. And that's exactly what Wahhabah is saying, is that while they might seem like they're fighting, but they're actually believing in the same thing. Their vision of the world is similar. It's the vision of this, right, nightmarish world based on this fundamentalist perspective. And that's why we're kind of like caught up in that whole clash, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we got to respect your time and bring this to a close. But I want to ask you one thing on this piece, which is, you and I both admire the work of Salman Said in critical Muslim studies, and he's a very creative scholar, written some incredible books. Well, Said, as you know, Robert, actually reads Islamism quite differently than most people do. He doesn't really see Islamism as a epistemic problem, as a fundamentalist. It's not really of the issue for him. Actually, he sees Islamism as a response to what he calls the collapse of the Western logos, like what he calls Westernese. And it's kind of, therefore, a kind of political epistemological counterweight to this kind of fraying kind of global hegemony of the Western discourse is waning, and Islamism is a kind of rival to that. But it has, in a way, a kind of emancipatory kind of dimension to it. So so could you juxtapose Said and Wahbah's vision there for a moment?
Okay. Well, Wahbah, first of all, does not single out Islam, and it's important to point that out. So when he talks about fundamentalism, he looks at religious fundamentalisms in general, but he also thinks about any kind of fundamentalism. So you can think of scientific fundamentalism. It doesn't have to be religious necessarily. For him, really, the bottom line is, if you think you have access to the absolute truth, and that could be a scientist or it could be a religious person. Once you believe that and you act upon that, then you're being dogmatic, and everything that you do will probably be not good, because you really believe you have access to the absolute truth. So for him, a key figure is in Islam is Ibn Rushd. For Wahba, he talks about him as a bridge between, let's say the West and the Orient, or the global North and the global South, however you want to put it. And so he's a theoretical bridge in the sense that, about the Latin Averroists, there was a whole school of thought based on that. And so what he likes about Ibn Rushd is his humanism, his emphasis on interpretation, kind of like hermeneutics in relation to the Quranic text. And that's why he ended up being rejected, because the whole debate at that point was, how do we approach the text, right? Is it open to interpretation? And that was his argument, or we should be literal about it. And that's ultimately the argument that won. And so he's for kind of a revival. His school of thought, Wahhabist school of thought, is reviving that kind of line that has been repressed in the history. So it's still something that's indigenous to Islam. It's not something from outside, but it's been repressed and hasn't been really, we didn't see its potential fully actualize itself.
I see. So then Sayyid's positive interpretation of the Islamist subject and so on, could that be made compatible with Wahba, or is that kind of not possible in a way?
That's a good question. I think it's the question of the connection between the religion and politics, right?
Yeah.
I think for Wahba, he would reject a politics that is theological, any politics. So that would be a major point of disagreement between them.
Yeah. I just want to say, for folks interested in contemporary Muslim political dynamics, I literally can't recommend Salman Sayyid's work enough. I just really find it valuable, in part because he comes from a very sincere and engaged position himself.
Right. And he studied with Lacan, so he also brings some of that.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. It would be amazing to bring him onto our program. Maybe in some future. Maybe we will in the future. Robert, I want to thank you for coming on. I think there's only one final thing I want to ask you as we wrap up here. Talk a little bit about, as a musician, you have this notion of the contrapuntal thing, which I think actually comes from Edward Said as well, because Edward Said is a music theorist as well.
And he was a pianist as well.
A pianist, okay. Yeah. What is that exactly, this idea? And you call it contrapuntal praxis. So it's an interesting term. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, I mean, so in music theory, counterpoint is when you have two separate melodies playing at the same time. So obviously, it creates some kind of tension that could result in harmony or dissonance or interesting polyrhythms, right? So the way Said uses it is kind of as a metaphor in terms of reading texts. Let's say the example that he uses is if you're reading, let's say, a text by, let's say, a British author in the 19th century. How is that text repressing what's going on in the world at that time, right? Is there any indication of, let's say, colonialism in that text? So he goes into the example of, well, some of these characters own a plantation. They don't really explore colonialism, but the fact that they own a plantation and that's there. So reading it contrapuntally is So there's that reading of what's actually going on in the text, but what's kind of repressed in the text, but what's going on in the world at that time, fleshing that out, and that would be the counterpoint to it. And so that brings in the kind of the periphery, right? Trying to see this text from the exterior, and that's really important to what I do in terms of, you know, looking at psychoanalysis in a sense from inside, but also from outside.
Mm-hmm. So it's a method of interpretation, it's a method of reading in a way.
Yeah.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful concept. Yeah. Well, this has been a rich exchange and a really deep dialogue that I'm grateful for having with you, Robert. And I want to do it. I want to do it again.
I appreciate you for inviting me.
It's been a lot of fun to have this exchange, and let's stay in touch. I'll link to the various works of Robert in the show notes. Is there anything you'd like to share with us regarding what you have cooking right now in terms of your research and your writing?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. There are some things I don't want to talk about, but I finished a book. It's like I'm about to send it to the publisher. It's gonna be open access, which is the first open access book I write. So it will be available for free. I can mention who the publisher is. It's Punctum Books, and so it will be available to download for free, but people can purchase a hard copy. I'll say that it's a psychoanalytic engagement with a key cultural figure in the United States. I'll keep it very vague, but I'm very excited about it. I really enjoyed writing it, and so that's finished. I'm working on another book on film theory, looking at the work of Yusuf Shaheen. I think actually you saw, I think we talked about this, you saw his film Destiny, Le Destin. So which is on Ibn Rushd, right?
That's right.
Right. So he's an Egyptian filmmaker that I admire.
That's
so
amazing.
I'm working on a book on him. Those are like really the two big projects for this year.
Well, we got to have you back to talk about this mysterious book.
I know.
That's amazing, Robert.
I'll announce it soon.
We wish you the best, and stay in touch with us, and we'll have you back for sure in the future, my friend.
Thank you, Daniel.
All the best. Peace out, everybody.